Our world is trembling. It's coming apart at the seams. The social systems, the political systems, and most importantly of all, our ecological system is breaking down.
Is it a given that the human species goes extinct? No. Does it look like that's what's going to happen? Very, very, very likely. It's really hard to see that this does not end that way.
Millions of people are suffering right now. It's worse than we were told. We are now in danger.
I don't know where things are going. I can't predict that. But all the elders that I know of say we have a sacred obligation toward how we're going to be here at this moment.
I'm Michael Shaw, and this is my journey to explore what it would mean if I accepted this threat is real. It's only been in recent times that I've been willing to look clearly at the stark realities of ecosystem breakdown. CO2 emissions and temperature rise rightly get a lot of our attention, but pollution, biodiversity loss, and the destruction of our natural world is moving at a runaway pace. I've been facing up to a realization that not only are we in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, but humans are very much on the list. Over the last few years, I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time with my friend, Catherine Ingram. As a Dharma teacher for close to 30 years, she's always had a keen eye for the truth, and her online essay, Facing Extinction, had gone viral since we met. It was in her company that the magnitude of the situation fully landed in me.
Very, very few people are looking at it directly. And even those who sort of are seeing the evidence and seeing, kind of becoming a little concerned, they're still having a hard time going the full distance with it. Even people who, you'll read them or watch a movie that they've done and it'll go almost there, but then there's this holdout for some sort of hope or some kind of fantasy green technology that might save us, or on and on. We all have seen this who are talking about these matters in this way. It's almost like people staring at Magellan's ships and not really understanding, not even seeing them, right? That's the apocryphal story.
I realized that I needed to meet and talk to others who were also looking clearly at this. I wanted to try and find a place in myself to hold it, and I also wanted to see how others were choosing to live their lives in the face of it. In order to make this happen, I had to sell my house. I had no experience making docos, and I also recognized that the premise itself would be unpopular. All in all, it's a scary edge to be walking, but a purpose in these times felt like a type of life raft. The first person I wanted to meet and speak to was Dar Jamal, and that meant getting over to the States. Here we go. I was really compelled by Dar's story. With no journalistic experience, he had followed an inner call to travel to Iraq and report on the 2003 war. He emerged from that having published 3 books and having won the Martha Gellhorn Award, but it was his writing about the unfolding climate tragedy that's brought me here. His articles had won him the Izzy Award for Excellence in Journalism. He had also published a book, The End of Ice, a book which I often refer to as a climate classic and still like to keep close at hand.
Delighted to be talking to you today, Dar.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah. I think there is a thing when we talk about the loss of ice, and certainly in the Arctic, there is a thing where people are hearing this information, but it's a bit abstract in some ways. I know in your book you've said our fate is actually tied to what happens there. What does it mean for us, the melting Arctic?
Well, it is easy to, especially for most of us that don't live up in the Arctic or that don't live directly within eyesight of a glacier or that aren't directly reliant upon that for our immediate drinking water needs, for example. It's easy to kind of think, oh, well, it's far away and yeah, it'll be a tragic loss, but whatever, like life will go on. It won't. No, life won't go on if we lose ice at the rate that we're losing it now, and this continues into the future, which it is going to. For example, in the Arctic, there's so many different ways we can come at this, but the loss of the Arctic sea ice is overtly going to be one of the most catastrophic consequences of the crisis. So we're looking at right now, one scientist I interviewed for my book, Dr. Harold Wanless, said, we are looking at over 100 feet of sea level rise that right now is already baked into the system. So that means if we stopped all CO2 emissions on a dime and did all the mitigation efforts we can possibly dream of,
Which we're not
even starting, that even if we had, we're still looking at 100 feet of sea level rise at least. And there's several other scientific studies that show anywhere from that to, 60 feet to 130 feet. Just pick your poison. Point is, even if it's on the lower end of that, that means every coastal city on the planet is gone.
I had to admit that my resistance to hearing this perspective was disappearing fast, but there were still so many questions I had. When Jem Bendel's paper, Deep Adaptation, came out in 2018, it not only had a big impact on me, but it had also sparked a whole movement by that name. I went to the residential workshop he led with Katie Carr and met him for a private conversation. The reason I'm here, what brings me here, is the paper that you wrote in July 18, Deep Adaptation. And you made a very strong statement in that about what you saw that was going on. And what did you see that was going on?
Yeah, so I concluded that climate change is much worse than what we've been told already, and that there were signs that it's now already has its own momentum. So these feedbacks, which will further heat the planet, they've already started, like the melting of the permafrost releasing methane, which warms the planet much faster than carbon dioxide, or forest fires, more frequent and more wide-ranging than ever before, also therefore producing more carbon. The soil's drying, producing more carbon. The ice sheets shrinking and therefore reflecting less light back to space and absorbing more into the oceans. So these are these self-reinforcing feedbacks, which it's quite obvious now that they're happening, and that means that climate change is speeding up. Our emissions are also speeding up. No matter what we've been doing, carbon dioxide emissions from humans has been going up since 1850 every year and at an increasing rate. So all this together, it was really scary. But the other side of it was then looking at what that would mean for our way of life. So often I'd read about this is going to be really bad for our children or grandchildren, or this is going to be really bad for particularly vulnerable communities in poor countries, perhaps living in hurricane zones or whatever. And then I actually realized that this was going to damage our own lives. When I say our own, I meant, me living in a Western person, middle-class life, that this is coming for me and people like me in my lifetime. So we're going to need to be much more public about that there's difficulty ahead. So the message has to become, millions of people are suffering right now. It's worse than we were told. We are now in danger. We must do all that we can to try and slow the problem down, but we must now also do all that we can to help each other through this. And it's that final bit which is not being said publicly yet.
In the other scientists' reports that I'd read, no one spoke like that. And it certainly got me thinking in entirely different ways, outside of the science and outside of the CO2 and the melting ice and into, how's this going to be in my life? But I also know you had a really hard time publishing that. It wasn't simple for you. Could you Just talk about what process you went through to get that out there.
So I wrote it, but I felt that I couldn't do it unless I fully expressed the truth as I saw it. So I wasn't surprised when the anonymous reviewers, that's the process for peer review, came back and they said, there's lots of good things in here, but it's not appropriate for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons was that you should not be concluding that it's too late to stop catastrophic climate change. And also that's going to be quite troubling for the readers. I couldn't, and the request to change it to make it suitable for publication would have stripped it of the emotion and also my own conclusion, which is that this isn't in doubt now. The only way one can say it's in doubt is if one chooses to stick to certain sort of paradigm of knowledge that, we can never be exactly certain about anything in the future. But I realize that gives you some kind of psychological, emotional escape. Say, oh, well, this might not be the case. Oh, we can't be absolutely certain. And that kind of helps you calm down. And I thought, well, that's not my truth. I mean, to me, this is certain now. And it opens up a whole new set of questions once you decide that it's certain that climate is going to really ruin our way of life. I'm encouraging us to think about what it might mean for local government and national government to start to get ready.
I could also feel this growing urgency to get ready for the days ahead, both practically and emotionally. But in order to do so as a world community, we have to start accepting the science and acting as if it's real. Yet in doing just that, it seems to come with this label of being a doomer.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, years ago, if I heard what's called the doomer view, I would think, but we must try and stop that happening. For me, hearing a doomer view would be impetus to try and cut carbon emissions and draw down carbon emissions and be more bold and ambitious and innovative in how we might do that. So I understand people who are allergic to hearing the view that it's too late to stop a disastrous amount of climate change and how that's going to make our societies fall apart. But I think they're wrong for a whole range of reasons. The first one is that people do not need a fairy tale future, a story of a fairy tale future in order to be motivated. We've seen that with the explosion of Extinction Rebellion around the world. Extinction Rebellion, the founders, and so I know them and I've been involved since the start, they're very clear that we are in a dreadful, perilous situation and we must do all that we can to give ourselves a better chance. So, yeah, I think the argument that this is somehow going to lead to apathy, despair or depression and not engagement on the agenda to cut carbon or draw down carbon, I think is just wrong. And there's also environmental psychology published to show that's wrong as well. It's that if somebody feels that climate change is now and it's close to home, they're way more likely to do something about it than if it's somewhere in the future affecting somewhere else, somewhere hot and poorer than where they're living.
It's too late to change this system. We have to be brave enough to admit to ourselves that we have to have a different kind of conversation about what to do next, even if it feels like we have no idea what that means. We have to be brave enough to start that conversation.
This felt true to me. We have to be brave enough to start these conversations, because if we don't, how are we even going to start to get ready? It does seem, however, like more and more people are willing to at least begin having it.
Yes, it's very scary, and it brings up a lot of despair and a lot of feelings of hopelessness. So is it not our job as adults to process through that, understand that, and now then ask some of the deeper, harder questions of, okay, so now what am I really going to do? And how then shall we live? And how are we going to be during this time?
I was lucky enough while away to spend some time with Native American elder Stan Rushworth. He's someone whose people had survived genocide and had personally suffered the lifelong emotional and physical impacts of being a Vietnam-era vet in the Far East. So I could think of no one better to talk to about how to approach living in these times.
My grandpa was born Cherokee man in 1894. My mother gave me to him. So I was 5 years old, and she said to him, which she told me when I was almost 40, she said, our way of life is in danger of dying. I want you to raise this child so it doesn't die. All right? So I am Cherokee by upbringing. I'm also an enrolled citizen of the Chiricahua Apache Nation. Not something I sought, but by invitation. And that's not something you would ever even think of saying no to. It's not either something that you would ever seek.
Yes.
It's a gift and a really, really deep honor. So then I went to an alien high school, and I was taught that Native people are in the past tense. You know, my friend Greg here was taught that his whole family was extinct. Okay? Literally, that's what he was told in his classes as a child. Your people are extinct. I'm right here. So I came up in that, and I became very difficult to deal with, I think, because I didn't believe that, and yet somehow those beliefs were imposed on me. So in a sense, I kind of forgot my grandfather's teachings in my own sadness and in my own grief. Perhaps that same grief that many people are waking up to now as they feel the future, their future being catastrophic. So my present was catastrophic. Okay?
And you come out now as a holder of this wisdom that we're hearing in this documentary. How have you come through that personally to be who you are now?
Barely. But that sadness and that grief and how to live with that, maybe even transform that, that's what people need to learn from Indigenous.
I guess the question that people might be asking when they're watching this is, okay, I'm speaking to a native elder. What could the traditional owners of the land say about climate change?
Well, I'll tackle one part of it first.
Right.
And that is to answer what could they say by telling you that they have been saying, this is all going to come back on all of us. And they've been saying it since day one. If you go back, this is part of the problem with people. People are listening to Native people now because their world is in danger. Okay? They're saying this is the end of life as we know it, so on and so forth. This is something that Native people have been dealing with ever since the colonists came. And I see too much people going leapfrogging over the genocide, you know, and saying, well, we want this ancient wisdom, but they really don't know what the ancient wisdom is, because that has to do with a relationship to the land, to the universe, to community that is really alien. You know, it's really alien. And our struggle as Native people today, because we're so influenced by colonial culture, that it's hard for us to inhabit that. And we need our ceremonies to inhabit that pre-contact experience. I'm kind of putting this back to the panic right now that is being formed around climate change, which is a future orientation rather than seeing the present orientation. and the past. How has this happened? Okay? You cannot fix you can't put something back together like a motor or something that you've taken apart unless you really look and see how you took it apart.
And just how did we create this situation? It wasn't just the Native Americans that had been through this. Western culture has been built on it. Best economic practice and protecting our way of life has meant doing whatever we need to whoever or whatever we need to keep this party going. It's so hard to look at this. I am part of this culture and have benefited from the profits of this past and still live in the privilege of its actions and its relentless precision.
Guilt is simply a human emotion. And for me, when I see a newcomer or a colonial person feeling guilt for what their forefathers did, I think it's a good sign, okay? Because it shows a sense of cultural collectiveness that goes across time and space, which is reality, okay? The whole notion of linear time and saying, okay, we can stop something here and say, well, this is no longer relevant to where we go in the future or to where we are right now. That's an arbitrary thing. It's not reality. It's a fantasy, okay? Time and space are intimately interconnected, not just, all my relations and, I'm you and you are me. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something really, really vast. So I think it's good to begin to tie into that. And of course, when you see all this destruction, the first thought is, oh my God, what happened here? Well, you have to answer that. You have to go in and say, well, what created this? What is this type of thinking?
There is certainly something, I think, that I carry around looking at the destruction of the earth and the natural systems. And part of me goes to this part of not liking myself as a human or some disgust with humanity that we might have done this.
Well, there are different thoughts about that. Some people say that, we were born and the native thought is we were born into the garden, so to speak. We were born into heaven. You guys were kicked out of heaven. Right?
Yeah,
that's
right.
the myth. Okay, so
Yes.
That's the story. So if you're kind of living with that story your whole life, of course you're going to be in self-loathing. Okay, because your creator kicked you out of the garden.
Kicked out of the garden
for misbehaving, right? And didn't really show you how to behave. That's the part where the guilt comes in, I think, and looking at how things have been taken apart. And those kind of myths, I think, are part of what needs to be examined on a really fundamental level. That things that make us fallen by nature, ideologies that make us fallen by nature, that make us bad, that make us, extra planetary aliens that don't know how to live here. Astrophysics says, no, we do know how to live here now. We've just forgotten it. Okay. So part of that is coming back into believing in ourselves as human beings. It's not human beings that have made things colossally dire. It's a particular type of thinking. It's a predatory type of thinking. Jack Forbes calls it the wetiko, which means cannibal. Because that predatory psychology is completely justified as being the natural state of man. Mm-hmm. And that's where the guilt comes from, because it's not true. Mm-hmm. And everybody knows in the deepest part of their heart that we're way better than that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That answer your
Yeah, thank you,
question?
Stan. That's just so beautiful.
we have a huge range within us, right? We have a range that will, like I say in the piece, there is so much mercy in some of us that we will give our own life for perfect strangers, right? It's amazing what the human range of consciousness is, from true depravity and utter just cruelty and thrill killing to this extraordinary level of sacrifice and kindness and love, right? And we all kind of know the range within ourselves. So you see it, if you step back and widen the lens big enough, you start to see it as an evolutionary projection, and that we've landed exactly where we were headed, right? This is what we did here, and this is now the consequences, and we will pay that price.
Between Catherine and Stan, I couldn't help thinking that collectively the darker side of our natures had dominated and led us down this path. Stan went on to relay an old story that warned of these times.
The story is that people were living on the moon, and there came about a difference in thinking. And one of the thinkings, as he put it, was that the moon was a gift, just like the earth is a gift, and it's to be treated as a gift, to be cared for, taken care of. The other thinkings that developed was that it was there for the use of humans in whatever way their whims decided that they could take. And so they got into what Daryl called exploitation of the resources. And these two peoples got into a big battle about that, and they invented weapons to go against each other for these two opposing thinkings that ended up blowing off the atmosphere of the moon, and all the people died off. So they essentially, that war of the thinkings essentially destroyed their ability to live there.
This story was many hundreds of years old, but it did seem like it was describing our current day situation right down to the letter.
We have an economic and political system which is structuring for stupidity. It's insane that UN Secretary General gave a speech where he said climate disruption is happening now and everywhere, and no one reported it. This is not sort of some wacko scientist or marginal journalist or something. This is the UN Secretary General saying climate disruption is happening now and everywhere.
See, I didn't even read that.
Yeah. So
the mainstream press is not reporting those type of stories, essentially.
Well, yeah, that's one thing, but also the press is the idea that the idea of news, like, that's just that sort of our sense of the way the world is just comes through news. Well, of course it doesn't. Corporations are the biggest storytellers in our lives. The price of a product is a story. The very nature of money is a story. The society we live in, where banks decide who gets the loans, that's all in the realm of story. The way we dress and the way we're told we need to buy this or that, this is all stories. All those stories are based on the hydrocarbon civilization, cheap oil and not caring about the atmosphere. So when I talk about collapse, it's as much a collapse of all that worldview, all that structure. So the money system, the advertising system, the fact that we need to consume stuff in order to have jobs, in order to pay bills. The whole market capitalist system, that's what's going to fall apart. And some people would say it should fall apart to help. I don't know if that's better. I just think that's just speculation, whether it's better to have a collapse of industrial consumer society now or not. I think there'll be a hell of a lot of suffering in any rapid change. So rather than making predictions, I just say that we we need to recognize how deep it goes, the predicament. How do we get into this predicament? We need to look and inquire deeply and make sure we don't repeat the same problems in our responses to this situation.